Today is Saturday, October the 13th, 2018. We're at the Community Media Center in Westminster, Maryland. I'm Gary Livengood. I'm interviewing John Cassady from, are you from Westminster, John?
I live in Franksburg.
Okay, from Finksburg,
Yes,
Maryland. And primarily we're going to focus on his military service, but then other aspects of his life. You were in the military, sir?
Yes, sir.
And what branch?
Coast Guard.
Coast Guard.
Yes.
And what was your rank in the Coast Guard?
Well, after high school, realizing that the draft was still in effect and didn't know what I wanted to do, I then made my inquiries and investigation as far as what service, and predominantly was the Navy and the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard was more to my liking and insofar as that was concerned. In fact, I took the Navy battery test to see what the test was going to be like before I took the Coast Guard test, realizing that the Coast Guard test was the hardest test of all the services to get into, and also, I might add, that continues today. That the Coast Guard's battery test, you've got to score higher on that than any of the other services. So went to boot camp in Cape May, New Jersey, had some sea time on the cutter Unimac, went back to the base, and I basically was a draftsman at the base at that time. And of course, the rate was not a Coast Guard rate, it was a Navy rate. So subsequently, the only rank I could achieve was a E3, right? So after my termination, as far as from 59 to 63 is when I got out of the Coast Guard and went to work for the B&O Railroad as a draftsman. I had a job before I came out. Was dissatisfied with the company and looked around to do something else. And eventually, law enforcement was the one I gravitated to and went into the state police in 1965. In 1965, after graduation, I was then assigned to the Annapolis Barrack and subsequently to the Glen Burnie Post, which operated out of the DMV at the time. And of course, worked the road. I was an investigator, was in second line supervisor, and eventually was a first line supervisor as far as a sergeant was concerned, and ran the shift insofar as that was concerned. And during that period of time, I happened to run into an individual that I was in the Coast Guard with during a job fair that I was representing the state police. And he initiated and said that the Coast Guard was looking for experienced people in law enforcement for their particular levels. It was port security. I then re-enlisted in the Coast Guard Reserve in 1970, and which required me to do 2 drills a month, and then 2 weeks during the summer. What that entailed was, as far as the port security rate, was one that inspected ships that came into the port, foreign flag, U.S. flag, all issues and that type of thing. And in one particular case, I was able to convince them that due to my fact of time off, I could work during the week with the regular side of the house rather than my 2 days of weekend drills, and they went for it. So I showed up and did my drills at the custom house with the regular side of that house, in doing the boardings, and of course gained more experience and knowledge in doing so. In one particular case, on board ship, we have to check the manifest to see what the cargo is being carried and whether there was any problems with the cargo in one hold versus another, because if you don't have the I'm trying to think of the word, in that if you have a dangerous cargo in one hold and subsequently could cause an issue at sea or whatever as far as a fire. So I inspected a lot of the holds, and in one particular case, I went into a hold and found about 4 automobiles, and they weren't on the manifest. Turns out the vehicles in question had New York tags on them. So immediately when I came out of the hole, I called the barrack. I said, run these tags for me to see if they're stolen. Sure enough, they were stolen. And they were going to be shipped out of the country to a foreign country. So we subsequently held up the ship, took them off. FBI got involved. New York got involved because they were out of their city. So besides doing that, I spent some time as a recruiter, as a reserve recruiter. Went to 2 inaugurals, the Jimmy Carter's inaugural, and also Ronald Reagan's inaugural, as far as because of my police background. It was more of a protectee type of situation for some of the selectees in the cabinet. In 1981, they saw fit, because of the nucleus of personnel that they had in the law enforcement area that was much more experienced in the regular side of the house, and made a solicitation for any of the reservists that wanted to transfer over to the special agents, investigators. So I made a report, asked for it, and subsequently received it. And in that particular case, I never, no longer at that time, 1981, I never wore a uniform. It was always civilian clothes because of what we were doing insofar as an investigator. And the Coast Guard Investigative Service is what it was known as, which is similar in nature as far as their jobs, as far as what you see on television. There's NCIS. Of course, we don't the crime involved, whatever it may be, we don't conclude it within an hour's period of time. It usually takes a little longer. In doing so, I worked with the regular agent at the Coast Guard Yard at Curtis Bay. And as he got to know me and my abilities or whatever, he would frequently call me to stop by the office to, either talk about it, something they were working on or whatever. So we dealt with not only the military side people, but also the civilian Coast Guard employees at the Coast Guard yards, involving theft, drugs, and that type of thing. In fact, one case we had, some of them were going out during lunchtime and doing the marijuana and cocaine, but coming back to work operating cranes and forklifts and that type of thing. So that was another issue. I went to the Olympics in 1984 as supplementing. The CGI supplemented the security for the Secret Service and for the foreign athletes. I went to a lot of schools, interview and interrogation schools. Went to a Secret Service training insofar as dignitary protection. Also their driving courses that they had as far as dignitary driving, pit maneuvers as far as what you would do in order to take a vehicle out. If you're driving a dignitary, how to get it through a roadblock. And we actually did on hands using vehicles that were going to be subsequently shredded. Before they were shredded, we were using them, so we're doing the ramming and that type of thing. I'm referring to some dates here because I can't remember everything.
And that's fine.
With you, right? Background investigations, that was a big thing that I did for For clearances, my area was Pennsylvania at the time. Went around, did employment, neighborhood, or whatever.
Now, this is when you were with the Coast Guard or with?
Coast Guard. I was
Okay.
still with the Coast Guard.
Okay.
Well, let me back up. Maybe I got ahead of myself and so forth as this is concerned. So what happened was, and I neglected to do this trail, was that I retired before coming on active duty back with the Coast Guard in 1986. I retired as a sergeant with the state police and also had remained in the reserves. And they put out a solicitation for people to come back on active duty, which I did. So I got ahead of myself as before. So came back on active duty as the agent, the other agent in the Baltimore office, the Coast Guard Yard. And I took, at the time prior to doing that, I took a job with the AI Corporation, which was the defense contractor, to help set up their security operation, but didn't like it. So when the opportunity came to come back on active duty, that's what I did. At that time, my rate was a E6, which is a first-class petty officer. And during the 2 years, wound up back to basically being 5 years, not 2. And during that period of time, I had one, they said was a homicide, but it turned out to be a suicide. And the interesting case in that particular thing was in Key West, Florida, where the individual that had committed suicide, which was a Coast Guard member, was involved in the satanic and the Satanism. He had all the symbolisms of Satan, the snakes, the pentagrams, and that type of thing. And after I got involved in doing it, found out that in the satanic, the ultimate goal is death. And he basically committed suicide in the barrack down there. I was involved in quite a few other thefts that occurred as far as on the yard. The last case, a big case that I had, as I said before to you, was we had an informant on a drug boat coming out of Colombia. It was a coastal freighter, and of all things that they took and put the drugs in was toilet paper. Loads of toilet paper. Now, if you can imagine toilet paper from Colombia, where it still had the threads of the wood in it, so if you wiped yourself, you're liable to get a splinter. And so far as using this toilet paper, but they secreted the drugs, the cocaine, into the containers of the toilet paper, which we then subsequently got. The interesting part of that particular case was that the offload took place off of New Jersey, and the fishing vessel that took the offload was owned by John Gotti's son. I subsequently had to, we did a search of the vessel, and we were involved with Customs, who had then became the lead agency insofar as the prosecution in the case. And this was after we had done a lot of legwork as far as intelligence gathering and that type of thing. And one of the things that I found in one of the staterooms was 35 millimeter canisters that had not been developed. So what these drug people did, especially coming out of Colombia, they would take pictures of themselves of the offload so that when they went back to Colombia, they would review and make sure that the contents was delivered in that particular case.
Yeah.
So the fact that I told Customs you get these things developed, and subsequently was a big factor in prosecution, that they had visual pictures of the offload taking place and what happened. That was basically the fifth, I was going into my 5th year. and my termination of the contract would have ended in December. I was asked to look through corporate officers in a oil pollution case by the Marine Safety Office in the Custom House, and subsequently gave them the information that they were requesting the next day. So they thought it was a big deal. But I said, if you know where to go, excuse me, it's no big deal. Anyway, I got a phone call the next day saying that, we know you're leaving and that type of thing, and they offered me a civilian job. Excuse me. And the civilian job was at the Custom House, ironically. It was the assistant chief of licensing for the Coast Guard Regional Exam Center, which basically interviews, tests, and subsequently will issue licenses to the mariners. Now, these particular licenses and questions will cover everything from master's engineering licenses, charter boat captains, the state pilots. I controlled those. And if you take a charter boat out of like Ocean City and that type of thing, the individual's got to be licensed in order to do so. So my staff at the time was about 15, and it was a mixture of both civilian and military. So I was doing that job and still maintaining my position as far as a Coast Guard reservist in the Coast Guard Investigation Service. Well, in January 2001, due to the fact that age and also service time, I was required to retire from the Coast Guard Reserve. So I had a total, I was a Chief Petty Officer at the time in E7, and I had a total of 33 years of Coast Guard Reserve and active duty time, 9 years of active duty and 24 years as a active reservist, and in that capacity. Stayed with the Regional Exam Center, eventually fleeted up to the chief of the licensing. And after 9/11 occurred, even though I was not investigating or an investigator anymore per se, I still had that in my mindset. And we found and developed information that a lot of the issuance of credentials were to Muslims. And we found out that in one particular case, a Yemen grocery store up in New York had about 13 to 15 people had used this address as where they lived. Well, it was a farce. Excuse me. Surveillance started to be taking place on it from the CGI, my former people, and subsequently, like in a 2-day service, the FBI came and knocked on our window and said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" So we finally told them what was going on. They were oblivious to, what was basically going on. So then it became a joint investigation. Insofar as it was a money laundering operation for the terrorists out of this particular grocery store. So that finished up, and then in 2013, after 21 years of being the chief of licensing for the Coast Guard at the REC in Baltimore, I said, that's it, I retired.
So it sounds like you've retired about 3 different times now.
Yes. State placed in '86, Coast Guard Reserve military in 2001, and then the federal government Coast Guard activity was in 2013.
And your Coast Guard experiences, it seems as though that ran the entire length of the East Coast?
East Coast, mainly the East Coast. Yeah. Well, we we were subsequently asked to do different things on a national area. Our area of responsibility as far as the investigation section, CGI, was Pennsylvania, because we had an office in New York, we had one in Boston, one in Charleston, and one in Miami as far as the East Coast was concerned, an investigative unit. So during those period of times, we were interfaced depending on what was going on with those particular other offices, but mainly my office was Maryland, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So anything that occurred within there that would require us to look into something would come under our jurisdiction. But like in '84 is when a whole bunch of them, because of the need for personnel, we went to the Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984 as the maritime side of the house to supplement the Secret Service for dignitary protection for the athletes.
Mm-hmm. So you have not been actively employed since what, 2013?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What have you been doing with yourself?
A lot of operations. I've had 2 hip operations, my back operations. My wife got on me about doing something. Volunteering. I was considering volunteering, and I was a swimming instructor and a lifeguard in my youth. Went to the Y down the street here and said, "Do you need anybody to help you out with teaching swimming?" So they called the aquatic guy over, and he starts talking to me and giving me all this stuff and whatever, and I finally realized he's offering me a job. I said, no, not a job. I'll volunteer. But the only problem is, because of my physical issues that have occurred since then, I'm starting to get better, but not what I think I should be. So that's on hold insofar as that's concerned. With the sheriff's office, Jimmy DeWeese, who I know, the sheriff from being in the state police, possibility of volunteering to help them out when needed. But right now it's just honeydews and keeping up with the house and all the other sundry things that life throws at you. But
well, it sounds like your experiences that evolved from the military into the state, into the all blended together.
yes, sir.
In investigative services of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm.
So, military experience gave you a nice jump start into other aspects of your career.
Yes, the big thing was of initially going back in, not initially as far as my initial active duty time for 59 and 63, but subsequently when I went back into the reserves, insofar as those particular positions in the reserves that have required certain things, and then the evolution as far as being in law enforcement, and the fact that they then saw fit to take law enforcement personnel and create the agent program, which was what basically occurred, and that happened throughout the country. So we had people in Portsmouth, Virginia, which was the headquarters of the 5th Coast Guard District, which is here, which was the main office, and I was in the satellite office as far as in Baltimore, because of the unit there being a big civilian activity. Excuse me. I got to take a drink of water here.
Oh, you're fine. So it sounds like you've had a varied experiences throughout your life, but is there any one thing or things that stand out in your mind or in your memory?
In as far as the military aspect?
As far as, be it military or be it outside the military.
I would have to say, insofar as I think it was a big mistake that the country did away with the military as far as a mandatory military position like Israel. Had we done so, I think we'd be in better shape insofar as the country as a whole is concerned. And going into the military, if you don't know what you want to do or whatever, then that's I think, the way to go. The Coast Guard in particular is to me, the stepchild of the other services. You don't hear about it, but in reality, if you really stop and think about it, gives more back to the public on a daily basis than any other services is concerned. Take any of your boaters that are going out on the bay or the ocean or whatever. If they get in trouble, you know, they're going to call the Marines. They're going to call the Army. No. So that I am. Think that, and of course realize that being a small outfit as we were, I think it's only in the 30-some thousand, 40,000 people total. So.
And therefore less spotlight in that it's only 30-some thousand. I say only when you compare it against the size of the Army or the Marines.
Oh yeah,
or
yeah.
et
Well,
cetera.
it was ironic this morning. The news had on there of a seizure of a whole bunch of drugs off of one of the vessels that were out there, one of the cutters that were out there for 50-some days and whatever. But again, we're the stepchild of the other services. We don't get the notoriety. Of course, they don't have the budget as far as recruiting is concerned. Mm-hmm. And just for an example, the cutter that I was on was Coast Guard cutter Unimac, and this was 1960. The Coast Guard cutter Unimac was a Navy seaplane tender during World War II.
Okay. Has it gotten more sophisticated?
It's gotten better, as you can see. We're not the hand-me-downs as far as the vessels are concerned from the Navy, which had been traditionally been done because of the budgetary things. But the vessels now are being built strictly for the Coast Guard in that respect. So you're not getting the stuff that the Navy no longer wants or use to be converted to a Coast Guard vessel.
And I'm making an assumption here that a good portion of the activity of the Coast Guard is drug interdiction, or am I incorrect?
Yeah, drug interdiction is one of the big things now. Of course, all the environmental things and so far as oil pollution and that type of thing is concerned. Is still the inspection of the ships and that casualties that occur, the issuance of credentials for people to be qualified. So the activity that they're involved in is still quite broad. It's become more of a law enforcement operation than it had been when I initially went in. As far as boarding the boardings are concerned, and also they're over in the overseas now in a lot of cases. As far as boarding the foreign flagships in the terrorist area. So, and of course, the aircraft operation is concerned. If you ever watch TV and watch the Coast Guard Alaska, it'll knock your socks off as far as what those guys do. They rescue swimmers that I think they're nuts going out and reviewing, but I'm prejudicial, I guess, being in the service for the Coast Guard and
Sure. Well, sir, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to cover during this interview?
I'm just glad I was born when I was.
Well, sir, I certainly appreciate your time, and I thank you for your service.
Thank you.